Well, I think we will get going here. Welcome to the 7th Green Ribbon Commission Climate Action Exchange. My name is John Cleveland. Along with my colleague, Amy Longsworth, we staff the Boston Green Ribbon Commission. As many of you know, GRCx is our interactive virtual program designed to support our mission of accelerating implementation of the City of Boston's Climate Action Plan. This program is the first in a series of 3 GRCx programs that we're going to do that are going to explore the intersection of climate, public health, and equity. This series is specifically sponsored by the GRC Higher Education Working Group, which has one of its goals to facilitate collaborative research that leverages the higher ed sector's capabilities to promote solutions for equitable climate resilience and mitigation. The first event, which is this, is going to explore the historical context behind today's climate injustices and their impacts on public health. The second program, which has been scheduled for April 27th, and hopefully you all will have gotten will soon get a link to it. We'll hear from a panel of researchers who have been studying climate impacts in 3 very focused areas: extreme heat, air quality, and healthcare delivery. The third program, not yet scheduled, is going to focus on the implications for how Boston implements its climate work from this research. And before I turn it over to our panelists, just a couple of logistical notes. We are recording this session. Shortly after the end of the GRCx program, you'll get an email with a link to the recording and also to all of the presenter slides. It'll also include a link to a short feedback survey. Third, if you have questions for the panelists, please put them in the chat box. Jennie Stevens, who's the moderator, will be drawing from the chat box for the Q&A session. And last and not least, for all of us Zoomers, please remember to mute yourself if you're not speaking. Next slide. I'm about to turn this program over to Jennie Stevens, who's a professor and director of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern University. Jennie has been chairing the task force for the higher ed working group that's been working on collaborative research, and she's going to do introductions for our totally cool set of panelists who are going to be the content of the program. So Jennie, I'm turning it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John. Great to be here, and thank you all for joining us. As John mentioned, this is the first in a 3-part series, and I'm really thrilled to introduce the panelists for today's discussion, linking climate, health, and equity issues. Today's discussion is really gives us an opportunity to explore kind of the legacy issues of why we are where we are today in terms of the climate injustices and health inequities, and understand a little bit about the historical context to help us prioritize and consider how to engage in where we are right now and in the future. So our 3 panelists, I will just give brief introductions, and we're going to hear from Cate Mingoya first, then Julian Agyeman, and then Mary Belen Power. And I'll just give brief introductions of each of them and then hand it over to them. They're each going to give about 10 or 15 minute presentations each to share their own experience and their perspectives and knowledge in these areas. And then we will have plenty of time for discussion and an interactive session. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go through. So we'll start first, we'll hear from Cate Mingoya, who is the Director of Capacity Building at Groundwork USA, where she works to strengthen the Groundwork network and provide technical assistance and support to brownfield remediation projects across the United States. Cate is originally from Queens, New York, and began her career teaching middle school to students in the Bronx and Brownsville and Brooklyn, and later transitioned to policy and doing policy work with low-income communities as the Director of Policy and Program Development for the Massachusetts Division of Public Housing. Cate holds a Bachelor of Arts in Biology from Reed College, a Master of Science Education from the City University of New York, and a Master of City Planning from MIT. And I think she's joining us from Somerville, Massachusetts. Next, after we hear from Cate, we will hear from Julian Agyeman, professor of urban and environmental policy and planning at Tufts University. And Julian is really one of the more creative and innovative transdisciplinary scholars in the space of connecting social justice and environmental sustainability. He is the originator of the concept of just sustainabilities and an internationally acclaimed leader in urban planning and environmental justice. He's from the UK and has degrees in geography and botany, conservation policy, and his PhD in urban studies. And he's the author and co-author or editor, co-editor of 12 different books and editor-in-chief and founder of Local Environment, a really important journal focused on justice and sustainability. And he's had multiple academic honors, and including he's a fellow of the UK Royal Society of the Arts. And so Julian will help us provide academic context and kind of theoretical context to the discussion about justice and equity and health and climate. Next, we will hear from Maria Belen Power, who is the Associate Executive Director at GreenRoots, Environmental Justice, where she oversees environmental justice campaigns and supports the work of the organizing team. She represents GreenRoots in the Green Justice Coalition of the Greater Boston area, as well as in national movements for environmental and climate justice. Maria Belen was awarded the Neighborhood Fellowship and completed her master's degree in public policy at Tufts University in the Urban Environmental Policy and Planning Department. Before we were talking about how Julian and Maria Belen knew each other from Tufts for sure. And before being at Tufts, Maria Belen did a year-long certificate program in nonprofit management and leadership with the Institute for Nonprofit Management and Leadership at Boston University. And she serves on the board of directors of the Student Immigrant Movement. Maria Belen grew up in a bicultural family in Nicaragua, and she brings to this discussion and to this work over 15 years of experience in organizing with undocumented immigrants, day laborers, and public housing tenants that have really informed her own understanding of the links between economic, social, and environmental issues. So really thrilled to be able to introduce these three panelists and really looking forward to the discussion. So I will hand it over, Cate, to you to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Cate, and I work with Groundwork USA, which is the national support organization for 21 people-centered environmental justice organizations. And I'm thrilled that we actually have 3 trusts in Massachusetts, where I am right now: Groundwork Somerville, Groundwork Lawrence in the Merrimack Valley, and Groundwork South Coast, which works in Fall River and in New Bedford. And generally what we do is put residents in the driver's seat to make changes to their built environment so that their spaces look and feel the way that they want them to. That's everything from taking over contaminated plots of land and transforming them into community assets like parks and trails and urban farms, to becoming the urban forester for a city and helping to densify its tree canopy. And really recently, we've moved into the climate mitigation space because we know that nationally, the consequences of a changing climate are not being felt equally. And that's true between states. They're not being felt equally. It's not being felt equally from city to city within a state. And it's not even being felt equally from neighborhood to neighborhood within a same city. And I'm here to tell you that that's not a coincidence and to dig into that a little bit further. We got to ask a really cool question. Is there a relationship between historical race-based housing segregation, and we're using redlining as a proxy for that, and modern day exposure to the consequences of the climate crisis, specifically extreme heat and precipitation? And if you want to poke around in some really fun and crazy interactive maps, head to our website to learn more about the project. So we pulled together 9 of the cities that we have trusts in to help answer this question. And before I go a little bit further, I just want to pause in case you don't know what redlining is, or it's been a hot minute since you've discussed it. I'm going to give you the really quick rundown. So imagine we're all back and it's 1933. We're in the Great Depression, people are struggling. At that point in history, you couldn't get a 20 or 30-year mortgage. Your mortgages were about 5 years. So you'd get a 5-year mortgage, you'd pay down the balance, and you'd have a pretty big lump at the end of those 5 years. So you'd need to re-up and get another mortgage. But by 1933, about 50%, 50, of the home mortgages were in default. So the federal government has this really big crisis on its hand. Folks are not making enough money, and we're about to see a really huge foreclosure crisis. So they developed federally backed mortgages. And what that basically means is the federal government created a policy to loosen lending from the private sector and said, hey, private lenders, I, the federal government, I'm going to vouch for these people. If they default on their mortgage, I'm going to pick up the tab. So the idea was to make this safer for lenders and promote wealth building through the acquisition of property. But they needed to figure out how to make decisions about who was going to get that federally backed mortgage because they're working with tax dollars. So they developed the Homeowners Loan Corporation to survey major American cities. Neighborhoods that were a safe bet that they felt really good about making loans to, those were outlined in green, and those tended to be wealthier and the right kind of white person. The neighborhoods that they felt like, hey, we are not going to do it, it's a quote unquote risky bet, they outlined in red or redlined and said those more federally backed mortgages are not going to be available. Those tended to be neighborhoods with Black residents and with immigrant populations or folks who are the not right kind of white person. And that creates a huge problem. If you're someone who's in a red-lined neighborhood and you want to move, for example, into a green or blue-lined neighborhood, you're not going to be able to because your very presence in that neighborhood threatens to reduce the grade of the neighborhood down from green-lined or down from blue-lined, making mortgages unavailable. So you're kind of stuck. If you own a property in a red-line neighborhood and you want to sell it, guess what? You're also kind of stuck because no one's going to be able to get debt to buy that property. So you're going to either have to work something out without the federally backed mortgage or accept less money, reducing your property value. And if you are a family that owns, that wants to own even in the redlined neighborhood, you're a family of color, guess what? You're going to struggle because you're not going to be able to get access to that debt. So you can't buy, you can't sell, and you can't leave. And I don't want anyone to leave under the illusion that redlining caused segregation. It just helped to codify the pre-1917 municipal level segregation that existed. So you're in this kind of a tough situation because there are now financial disincentives to investing in those redlined neighborhoods. That community has really low valued property because you can't sell for much. So the tax base is low, and you see municipalities not investing in placing parks or densifying the tree canopy cover. In some cities, you even see the city not upgrading the sewer infrastructure in those parts of town. And then residents who own homes in those neighborhoods can't draw on that equity as easily to help make improvements to their property. So you see a financial disinvestment and less investment in that neighborhood. And one thing that I like to point out to folks is to think about when that what redlining itself became outlawed in 1965. And if you are like me and you are an elder millennial, that means that your parents are one of the first generation that had unencumbered access to the mortgage market. And I want you to think about what that means for intergenerational wealth. On the next slide, I'm going to finally make that connection between the climate crisis and the process of redlining. The next slide is going to show you Elizabeth, New Jersey, which is a city that is south of New York City. And you're going to see a digitized redlining map on top. As a quick reminder, green, white residents, you can get those mortgages. Red, people of color, you can't get those mortgages. Keep your eye on any red square. It doesn't matter where it is, just keep your eye on one. This green that you're seeing is tree canopy cover as of 2016. This is impervious surface, so like parking lots, driveways as of 2016. And then this is relative heat, with red being the hottest. Now look for any green square. It doesn't matter where it is. Keep your eye on any green square. Tree canopy cover, impervious pavement, parking lot, driveways, things like that. And then relative heat, with red being the hottest. You're probably starting to notice something, but if the eye test isn't working for you, this is the punchline. As you go from A, those green lined neighborhoods where you could get those mortgages, to D, those redlining neighborhoods where you couldn't, that red bar of relative heat, that goes up. It's hotter in the redlined areas. Impervious pavement, that gray bar also goes up. We can use that as a proxy for flooding, because if it rains, where's the water going to go? It's going to pool up and it's going to flood. And then my least favorite one of these, tree canopy cover, as you go from A to D, there's a precipitous decline. And we also see this here in our backyard in Haverhill. You see something similar where those neighborhoods that were historically redlined have less tree canopy cover, more impervious pavement. They're hotter. And then you also see higher clusters of poverty in those neighborhoods. So we're starting to see that there's some sort of a long-term relationship here. You might say, Cate, all right, redlining happened a really long time ago. I know that it's hotter in neighborhoods that were redlined, but is this a race issue? And the answer is still yes. It often is yes, because today about 75% of those neighborhoods that were graded D back in the 1930s are still low to moderate income neighborhoods. And 2/3 of them are still majority minority neighborhoods. So as James Baldwin says, the past is not past. At this point, if you've studied anything related to race at any point in America's history, you're probably disappointed, but not terribly surprised. But you might have a question. What if my community was not redlined? Is my neighborhood off the hook from this legacy of environmental justice and racism? The answer is also no. And I like to use Lawrence as an example of this. If you don't know of Lawrence, it is a small planned mill city that's just north of Boston in the Merrimack Valley. The Merrimack River runs right through it. It used to produce textiles, harnessing the power of that Merrimack River. And Lawrence was never redlined as a planned city, but the cities around it and the more suburban areas did have risk assessment maps created for it, which means that some of those neighborhoods were redlined in the cities surrounding Lawrence. And so in the very center of this image, you see Lawrence, and then surrounded by Methuen, Andover, and North Andover, neighborhoods that did have risk assessment maps created. And you see that Lawrence has less tree canopy cover, more pavement, it's hotter, and there's a higher cluster of poverty. So even though Lawrence itself was not redlined, you do see the impact of this federal policy on this community. And this is the last thing that I'll say about this piece before I move on, but this is actually Cincinnati and the difference between the lower Price Hill neighborhood on the right, which you can see a lot more pavement, a lot more lots, highway cutting through it, versus a different neighborhood that was green lined, and you see a much denser tree canopy cover. So you see this story over and over again in cities across the United States. And the absolutely groundbreaking work that's done by Jeremy Hoffman and Vivek Chandas around this picture at a national level shows that on average, neighborhoods that were redlined are 4.5 degrees hotter than neighborhoods that were greenlined at the same time on the same day. But that can be as extreme as 16 degrees Fahrenheit. And I want you to think functionally about what that feels like. That's the difference between turning on your air conditioner and not. That's the difference between going for a walk with your family on a beautiful summer evening and ending up in the hospital with heat stroke. So there's a pretty big difference we need to pay attention to. You might be thinking, okay, cool, Cate, got it. Historical racism, hotter, wetter. The solution is to plant things. The answer is kind of, you probably should. Please plant a tree in front of your home. Please encourage your city to do the same. This tree is in front of my apartment in Somerville. And I think that, just as an aside, I think baby trees, like baby birds, they're the only things that aren't cute when they're babies. They're just kind of scrawny. And it casts a shadow in my neighborhood that's about the size and shape of a pizza box. It's not doing a lot, and it's actually limited by those power lines in how big it can grow. So this isn't a 100% solution. It's not a panacea. We start to move into greater solutions when we ask the question, why hasn't this been done already? And that's a lot of what the Groundwork Network is working on through our Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership. We understand that the reason our neighborhoods look the way that they do, it's not by accident, it's by intentional systemic design. So we're organizing residents for systems change. In our Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership, we're organizing residents to help them understand why their neighborhoods look the way that they do, have residents prioritize the mitigation measures they would like to see in their neighborhood, and then build their capacity to intervene in policy systems and planning systems so they can self-advocate for a more equitable distribution of resources. And we use these visualizations, and they're really important because people respond to that unfairness. Why is it in the Hispanic neighborhoods in Elizabeth, New Jersey, there's such lower tree canopy cover compared to other neighborhoods? Why is the north side of Richmond so much hotter than the south side? People really respond to that unfairness. And when you see it laid out like this, it's very hard to look away. It's very hard to not do something about it. Two quick examples of how we're working on that. In Denver, Colorado, residents were interested in ballot 2A, which was passed to create a steady stream of tax funding for parks maintenance and capital backlog. And they were really interested in the Globeville neighborhood, which used to be a Superfund site, had a lead smelting plant there, to see some sort of environmental improvements made to their community. And 100% credit goes to the residents who are poking around in the portal that we created, and they discovered, hey, our neighborhood has 1% tree canopy cover. But if you hop on a bus and go across the river, you can be in neighborhoods that have 24 to 60% tree canopy cover. We want that. So residents came up with the idea that they wanted 10,000 trees in 10 years and a say in future funding distribution. And that's what we're working on residents with. Similarly, in Richmond, Virginia, where there's a really big difference between areas that are experiencing the urban heat island effect and those that aren't, the master planning process for the city of Richmond occurred over the last 3 years, and residents were successful in getting language put into the master plan that prioritizes neighborhoods with a high heat vulnerability index. That just means neighborhoods that are relatively hot and have a low income. Those tend to be the same as redlined neighborhoods, to help prioritize those neighborhoods in green infrastructure and tree canopy cover funding. So residents are using these maps and using these tools to help intervene in systems to make change, to change the system and the way that resources are distributed. I'll wrap up by saying that grassroots efforts can meet community need, but there is no panacea. There is no 100% solution. At best, what we're looking at are cobbling together a bunch of 1% solutions in the name of systems change. And that's everything from the short-term work that our groundwork trusts do, from building bus shelters so folks are in hot neighborhoods aren't waiting out in the pounding heat, or making sure that residents who need it are getting high efficiency air conditioners and swapping those with their neighbors, to medium-term systems change elements, like making sure that residents have a seat at the table, making sure that money that going into green infrastructure projects stays in the community and that residents are able to get employment and build their capacity through these greening projects and programs. And I'll leave you with the idea that we all need to invest in our communities. There's nothing inherently deficit about those communities and the people that are in them. Folks know what the right things are. They know the ways in which their neighborhoods need to change. They need support and they need resources so that they can make their neighborhoods look the way that they deserve to look. So I'd love to talk more about this. Check out our website, groundworkusa.org. Reach out, and happy to talk more about this with you folks, and looking forward to the question and answer session. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Well, Cate, thank you so much. That was really great, and a lot of stimulus for talking about organizing system change. And I think that was the best description of redlining that I have ever heard. So
thank you
for explaining it like that so well. Thank you. Next, we're going to hand it over to Julian.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks, Cate. You really set me up nicely, I think, for my presentation. So as the academic, I'm going to give the wider picture and put some very fancy names to some things that Cate said. I'm going to talk about this concept of just sustainability, and I'll explain that, but first I want to offer a land recognition. I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm presenting on the traditional territory of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people. And I want to pay my respects to their elders, their past, present, and future, and for all of us to commit to a principle of respect and care as part of this meeting. Now, I want to disavow you that this is merely a book sales event. You've just seen 2 of my books, and apparently the psychologists tell me if I leave this on for 45 seconds, 20% of you will be on Amazon buying it within the next couple of minutes. So I've just got to get the timing right. The point I want to make here is that this idea of just sustainabilities was a reaction to what I call the equity deficit in much sustainability theorizing, practice. 20 years ago, if you looked at all the databases, best practices, it was always about green stuff. And green is really important, but I could imagine a world where we regulated for green policies that was also deeply socially unjust. So simply having greening does not imply justice. It could, if we think about social justice and environmental sustainability, not as separate goals, but as achievable goals together. And I would even argue that the reason we're in the mess we're in at the moment, not achieving goals in environment or social justice, is because we've seen the 2 as absolutely separate. So this book really looked at equity and justice and the links between environmental quality and human equality. What is obvious to me, if you look around the world, where environmental degradation is happening on a large scale, it's always associated with issues of human rights and social injustice, whether it's the Niger Delta, the Congo, the Amazon, whether it's the Kamchatka Peninsula, it doesn't matter. Environmental degradation is associated with human rights abuses. So I would say sustainability cannot simply be seen as a green issue or an environmental concern, important though that is. We need to think about a truly sustainable society as being one where wider questions of social needs and welfare and economic opportunity are integrally related to environmental limits. And we need to think about environmental limits. Now, I don't usually advertise other people's books, but if you want a book that really nails this environment equity link, this would be the book. Two British researchers collected 40 years of quantitative data, comparable data across the world. And what the book showed is it's not poverty, excuse me, it's not poverty, it's inequality that is the biggest problem we face. It is corrosive at every level in society, even as people get more and more wealthy. But I think the really interesting thing about the book is it showed that it's the gap between rich and poor, and the countries with the biggest gap between rich and poor had more social problems, from teen pregnancies to drug abuse to domestic violence to school failure, etc., etc. So the bigger the gap between rich and poor, the more social problems. What was interesting as well in the book was that they found that if you look at advertising revenues and inequality, advertisers love inequality. Inequality sells because people want to keep up with the Joneses. And in the book, they call it competitive consumption. The poor trying to get into the middle class, the upper middle class. There is an escalator of consumption in unequal societies. Now, let me bring this to something that you're interested in, which is climate change. Inequality heightens competitive consumption. Competitive consumption heightens our carbon footprint. More unequal societies tend to have larger carbon footprints, i.e. are more responsible for climate change. How often do you hear climate change researchers talking about the need to decrease inequality both within countries and internationally? We always hear them talking about sustainable agriculture, need for sustainable transportation, absolutely. But if we're thinking about the drivers of climate change, inequality, both within and between nations, is a key driver. So if we really want to understand sustainability, or just sustainability, I think we need to think about these human equality issues as well as those issues of environmental quality together, not as separates. So this idea of just sustainability then came about when we realized that there's a need to ensure a better quality of life for all, now and into the future, in a just and equitable manner, while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. And there's 4 conditions here. We must commit to improving people's quality of life and well-being. We must commit to meeting the needs of both present and future generations. It's not just about the future, it's about now. And we must also commit to justice and equity in terms of recognition, process, procedure, and outcome. Now, I want to concentrate on that word recognition. This is, I think, a really important point for you to grasp. At the moment, there is no better expression of recognition than Black Lives Matter. You could say Me Too as well, or the cries for indigenous rights in other parts of the world, including the US. Recognition is a precursor to justice. If we don't recognize the rights to be of certain people, how can we ever have reconciliation or eventually reparations if we do not recognize the rights to be? So this idea of recognition, I think, is a very important pre-justice tool, in a sense. If we don't recognize, how can we do justice by people? And then, of course, all of these 3 first conditions need to be done within the 4th condition, living within ecosystem limits. Now, working in urban planning, I want to give you 3 points that I think, again, are very important for your understanding of inequality, cities, public health, and issues of climate change. One of the best definitions of urban planning: managing our coexistence in shared space. Coexistence in shared space. That's what we do as urban planners. We manage coexistence in shared space, whether we're talking about environmental issues, transportation, housing, other conflicts. It reminds us that we are increasingly in cities of difference. We're not managing coexistence in shared space amongst everybody who does everything alike. We are increasingly different and diverse in our cities. How do we manage coexistence in shared space with people who are different from us? It's both a challenge, but it's a huge opportunity. Second point, we as urban planners, as sustainability advocates, we're always thinking about what can our city become. It can become more resilient, more sustainable, more sharing, more smart. But what we're forgetting is who gets to belong. Who gets to belong in our cities? We're getting increasingly good at pushing people out of cities through gentrification, through displacement, moving homeless and unhoused people along, through xenophobic actions on immigrants. I want to see urban planners do a better job at balancing this idea of belonging and becoming, because ultimately the city that we get, the city that becomes, will only become as good as the population who is allowed to belong. I don't want elite imaginings of what cities can be. I want us all to be thinking about what the future city can be. And then I want to just think a little bit about one of the ideas behind new urbanist thinking, which is human scale planning. And absolutely we need human scale planning, but I, from this day onwards, want you to put an E after human. I want humane scaled planning, planning with empathy, planning with humility, planning for human dignity. This is what we need. And I think just sustainability helps us think through coexistence in shared space, the relationship between belonging and becoming, and this idea of humane scaled planning. Now, I want to give you two examples briefly in the time I've got. I want to talk a bit about this. I told you I give big words to, or big concepts to ideas. Spatial justice. How do we allocate rights in urban spaces and places? And then I want to talk a little bit about Minneapolis. How does one of the most green liberal cities in the US end up as the epicenter of our current introspection over structural racism? First, let's look at spatial justice. I mean, Cate's presentation in a lot of ways was talking about spatial injustice, the fact that certain neighborhoods are marked by design, not by accident, for different treatment, worse treatment. Social justice says life chances shouldn't be distributed along class lines. Spatial justice says opportunity should not be distributed geographically. Now, one of the most extreme forms of spatial injustice would be a wall across part of a city, like in Jerusalem, or Nicosia in Cyprus, or formerly in Belfast in Northern Ireland. We don't have many walls across our cities now, but we do have creeks, we have railway lines, we have freeways, and we know what happens. On one side they live, and on the other side you live, and your life chances and life expectancy are much better than theirs. Spatial injustice is designed into our cities, as I'm going to show you. Why is zip code a better predictor of health than genetic code? And here we have the Delmar divide, which is a classic case of spatial injustice. On one side, largely African-American, the other side, largely white, and the health disparities are huge. A zip code should not determine anybody's future, let alone a child's future. So we've baked in spatial injustice through urban planning. And let me just bring it down to the street level. Look at these two streets. On the right, Mass Ave in Cambridge, on the left, Södervägen in Gothenburg, Sweden. They couldn't be more spatially different. They're identical width, but in Sweden, they've democratized the street. They've imposed spatial justice. They've prioritized the active transportation people, the cyclists and the walkers. They've prioritized streetcars. They are frequent and they are free. And to the left of the streetcar, you can see the one part of the road that is available to people in private vehicles. How does a kid growing up on these two streets turn out after 10 years of coming out to see basically organized chaos on Mass Ave and a democratized street in Sweden? How does a kid turn out? Now, we have data on this. We know this from Don Appleyard's work in the late 70s in San Francisco. We can see that basically street traffic largely determines social interaction on streets, and that lightly trafficked streets have many more, people on lightly trafficked streets have more friendships and social acquaintances than they do on heavily trafficked streets. What's the just sustainabilities or environmental justice take here? Who lives on the heavily trafficked streets? Who is more likely to be injured or killed by a vehicle? And the data is absolutely clear on this. The lightly trafficked streets are in the traffic calmed neighborhoods, places with livable streets, with complete streets. So we start to see that our cities are not some kind of accident. They are actually the way they are through design. And the same with parks, another big public space. I mean, streets are a public space, parks are a big public space. Parks are not being disused by anything other than patterns of design and management. I would say patterns of design, management, and programming affect who can get to go to a park. Are we really thinking about culturally inclusive spaces? Who designs these parks? Couldn't we co-design, co-manage, and co-program parks with communities? Couldn't we extend that professional community boundary into thinking about public spaces in an intentional way? And the importance of this is this idea of contact theory. Contact theory says, if we have spaces and places that are amenable, people will meet each other, and they will, the more contact you have with people who are different from you in any sense, the more likely you are to become tolerant. So contact theory, I think, is a really useful concept for urban planners. We need to be designing spaces and places of interaction, of engagement, where people can meet across difference. To have anything other than that would be spatially unjust parks and public spaces. I said I wanted to talk a little bit about Minneapolis. So Minneapolis is a super green city. It's a bit like Portland, Oregon, in the sense that it's got this reputation for being super green. Cate was talking about park spaces. Well, Minneapolis has got the best park system in the United States, 10 years on the trot from the public land, Trust for Public Land. It's one of the best cities for exercise. It's got the third most bike commuters. It's affordable. It's got opportunity. It's got wealth. It's got all of these things if you're white. But if you're not white, it's not such a good place. Racial inequality in Minneapolis is among the worst in the nation. The income gap, what people have paid for their jobs, is huge, nearly the worst in the nation. It is the worst in the nation for the wealth gap, which is the black-white home ownership gap. And it is very high in the inequality of K through 12 achievement, or the opportunity gap, in terms of white and Native American and white and African American students. So you can see here, we could look at Minneapolis and think, wow, it's a green city, that's super duper. But it's super duper if you can benefit from that, and not everybody can benefit from that. So why is this? I was going to call this Minneapolis WTF, but I thought maybe not. I'll just call it Y or something like that. But the point is, Minneapolis has been playing this game of positioning itself as a model metropolis at the cutting edge of great urban planning. And according to Kirsten Delegard, who's the founder of the Mapping Prejudice Project, which is really worth a look at, she said there are certain darker truths about the city. So I thought, well, what are these darker truths? Because apparently in the 1800s and up to 1900, Minneapolis had a small but pretty well spatially dispersed African-American population. And then in the early 1900s to the 1960s, we got the racialized covenants. This home shall not be rent or sold or otherwise leased to anybody other than people of the Caucasian race. No Negroid, Mongoloid, Oriental. I mean, the racist language around these covenants is horrific. And these finished in the 60s, but of course they didn't really finish. I mean, legally they finished in the 60s, but the thinking carries on. Until 1917, when the Supreme Court struck it down, racialized zoning was legal. When it was struck down, cities started to think, well, what are we going to do? We can't do it in a racist way. Let's do single family zoning. Let's do it on a price basis. So single family zoning now makes up 70% of residential land in Minneapolis. And interestingly, they built a racial cordon around the parks in Minneapolis. So all of the parks are rimmed by single family zoning, again, to keep out low-income and minority people. And then, as was explained by Cate brilliantly, and so I won't go into it, then we had redlining. So covenants, racialized zoning, then single family zoning, then redlining. The result is racial segregation then and now. There's only one country in the world did it better than us, and that was apartheid South Africa. This was intentional, this was deliberate. And Heather Worthington, who was director of long-range planning, agrees that there's a direct linkage between those practices in the late 19th and early 20th century and today's modern zoning plans. And the reason for change is that they recognize that change is needed in zoning and in all of these regulations if we're going to have any attempt to pick apart systemic racism in urban planning. I put it more simply in an article I wrote: urban planning is the spatial toolkit for articulating, implementing, and maintaining white supremacy, and we can do something about it. And Minneapolis is a young, activist, progressive, democratic city council. First thing they did was to abolish single-family zoning, allowing duplexes and triplexes on single-family zoned land. They've got inclusionary zoning packages, and the Minneapolis 2040 plan is really worth a look. The first goal is to eliminate these disparities, these inequalities. By 2040, Minneapolis will see all communities fully thrive regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, country of origin, religion, or zip code, having eliminated deep-rooted disparities in wealth, opportunity, housing, safety, and health. So it's really interesting to me to see that this green city, this activist, democratic, progressive city, has inbuilt within it these racist and supremacist urban planning tools that need to be changed if any progress is going to be made. So I just want to summarize then, managing our coexistence in shared space. We live in cities of difference. We need to do better at managing our coexistence in shared space and celebrating our coexistence in shared space. We need to foster belonging in terms of recognition and difference, and thinking about what our cities can become. Urban planners are dreamers. We've always thought about the future, but we also need to think much more about who gets to belong in our increasingly expensive cities. We need to foster engagement. We need to move beyond demographic data. Let's look at ethnographic data. Let's have community ethnographies that are built by communities and urban planners and urban policymakers that can be drawn on to deeply understand communities beyond just 20% Latinx, 20% African American. That means nothing. We need deep ethnographies. We need to engage in intercultural and culturally competent planning and policy making. And that's different to declaring, equity and social justice as goals. Cultural competency is a different set of skills, and we need to learn those. We need to practice humane scaled as well as human scaled urban planning. And above all, I want to leave you with the idea, social justice never simply happens. Show me a policy that was designed around technical efficiency, economic efficiency, and environmental protection that also delivers social justice, and you can have a complete set of my books, because it just doesn't happen. We need to center equity and social justice as part of the policy making process. And if I had longer, I would give you reams of examples of where that intentionality has delivered real results. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Julian, for so well synthesizing many things, including some theory and some other examples. And I really appreciate how you explained how inequality is a driver of climate change, and recognition, belonging, the empathy, and really thinking about shared space and interactions and engagement in new and different ways. And I see we already have questions for you, Julian, but we're gonna hold the questions. So thank you for everyone who's been putting questions in the chat. We're keeping track of them, and we will get to them. But first, we get to hear from Maria Belen, who will bring us back to Boston with more specific examples about how some of the work that she's involved in is coming together on climate, health, and equity. Thank you so much. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks, Julian and Cate. I'm going to share. Great, so thank you. Good morning. My name is Belen, and you may not know me, but I know that we are connected through a river and a community that I call home. Road salt, home heating fuel, fresh produce. If you've ever wondered where those come from, well, at one point, they were stored on the banks of the Chelsea Creek and across our communities. Chelsea is the smallest and second most densely populated city in the Commonwealth. At just 1.8 square miles, Chelsea has over 45,000 residents, 73% of which identify as a racial or ethnic minority, the majority of which are Latino and Latina like myself, who came here from Nicaragua. 24% live below the poverty level. In neighboring East Boston, there are 55,000 residents living in 5 square miles, 3 of which are occupied by Logan International Airport. 53% of East Boston residents identify as Latino and Latina, and 17% live below the poverty level. GreenRoots is a resident-led environmental justice organization working to engage some of the most vulnerable populations, empower them to become strong leaders, so together we can implement innovative projects and campaigns that improve our public health and our quality of life. Our communities are providing some of the largest regional benefits while shouldering the burdens for air, land, water, and noise pollution from those very same industrial activities. 100% of the jet fuel that's used at Logan International Airport is stored on the banks of the Chelsea Creek. 70 to 80% of the region's home heating fuel are also stored on the banks of the Chelsea Creek. 400,000 tons of road salt that are used in over 350 communities in the Northeast are stored on the banks of the Chelsea Creek. Chelsea is also home to one of the largest produce distribution centers in the country, serving the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic states, and Southern Canadian provinces, bringing in thousands of trucks in and out of our community daily. Massachusetts, despite its progressive reputation, when it comes to public health, has some of the most profound race and class disparities. In 2016, the Center for Effective Government graded Massachusetts and only one other state an F for exposing people living below the poverty level and communities of color to hazardous facilities. Our communities have some of the highest rates of strokes, cardiovascular disease, and asthma hospitalization in the state. Now, we could sit back and allow these disparities to happen, or we can organize to create change. And we've chosen the latter and have had some pretty amazing victories. In 2006, we learned that Chelsea's diesel exhaust level exceeded the EPA's threshold by 20%, and that our expected cancer cases caused by air pollution was 500 times higher than the rest of the state. Together with the New England Produce Center, we applied for $3 million to retrofit or replace 132 dirty diesel engines. And by doing so, we eliminated 2,000 tons of air pollutants annually, improved public health, and reduced healthcare costs in our community. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of Cape Wind. Well, the very same proponent that was planning clean energy for Nantucket was proposing a dirty diesel power plant across the street from our only elementary school complex on the banks of the Chelsea Creek. When GreenRoots got wind of that proposal, we immediately notified the community. And we used every single tactic in the organizer's playbook. We mobilized, we wrote letters, we testified, we negotiated, and even protested. And eventually we were successful in defeating that proposal. And now children like my own, Maya, who is 7, and Ana Victoria, who is 3, can play in this very same playground without breathing in the fumes of a dirty diesel power plant. Right now, we are engaged in a very similar struggle. The Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs just gave its final approval to Eversource to approve and to build an electrical substation on the banks of the Chelsea Creek in a dense neighborhood of East Boston, a neighborhood of primarily low-income residents and people of color. This substation was initially approved during a 2017 hearing where interpretation for the residents was not provided, even though we requested it ahead of time. If built, the substation would be located on a parcel of land not only projected to flood, but has flooded several times in the past. It would also go next to 8 million gallons of jet fuel and adjacent to a heavily utilized playground. This type of infrastructure is the opposite of building for resiliency. As we work to reduce emissions and electrify our grid, we cannot keep on piling the burdens in Black and Brown and immigrant communities. We will do what we do best, use every single tactic in the organizer's playbook to fight back against what will be a ticking time bomb in our communities. This is what could happen if something goes wrong. Now, despite the struggles of environmental racism that we face, we are committed to a just transition and to building the solutions from the ground up. We are currently working on a community-led microgrid by partnering with a technical team of energy experts and engineers. We have been collaborating over 4 years to develop a clean energy, community-centered microgrid. We have prioritized key infrastructure through community-led processes and have strong partnerships on the ground with the city, medical centers, and the housing authority, as well as affordable housing developers and residents. This type of infrastructure that is anchored by strong community relations will provide energy and climate resilience to our people. Now, I want to end by highlighting something that we all know, and if we didn't, we've learned in this past year. COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted low-income communities and communities of color across the country. In Massachusetts, Chelsea has been one of the hardest hit cities by the virus. We had the highest rate of infection for months. In fact, at one point, we had as much as 5 times the state average, and even higher than some of the hardest hit boroughs of New York City. We know that this is in large part due to our environmental burdens, social determinants of health, as well as our race and class disparities. 80% of Chelsea's workers were deemed essential employees. My community did not have the luxury to isolate or to work from home. Unfortunately, Massachusetts has yet again failed to learn its lesson. Despite the fact that the pandemic uncovered so many inequities, we continue to exclude the most vulnerable, whether it is through the siting of dangerous infrastructures, reducing public transit service when our folks need it the most, or a flawed vaccine rollout that has not prioritized the hardest hit communities, Black, Brown, and immigrant communities. The intersection between public health, environmental burdens, and race are real. And the consequences of inaction have real implications for life and death. Our folks have sacrificed their lives and died on behalf of the economy and the region. We as a state have to do better to protect the most vulnerable communities. Thank you.
Mary Belen, thank you so much. Very powerful. And thank you for sharing that your activism and the successes and also the current struggles. Many people are asking how others can get involved and whether Green Roots offers trainings and of the organizer's playbook. So we now have a chance. We have another half an hour of this session, and we already have quite a few questions in the chat. So I'd like to start us off with kind of an overarching question that I think is that I draw from several of the questions about how each of you in different ways have shared with us, an alternative way that things could be, and an explanation helping us understand why and how the inequities and injustices have become so prominent, right? And these efforts to show us that a different way is possible. I guess I'm curious to each of you, how would you suggest, or how do you encourage us all to think about how we can make a justice and a people-focused priority kind of the norm and the mainstream, right? Rather than all struggling in our activism that, as Maria Belen pointed, so this exclusion, right, that is systemic. How can we? What are some of the tangible things, ways that we can all think about mainstreaming the justice at the forefront of our climate and health policies and processes? And so that's a general question for all three of you. Maybe we could hear from each of you, and then I'll be looking through the other questions and pose some other questions. You each received several specific questions to each of you as well that I'll come to in a minute.
I can jump in on that. I think the biggest one is to not speak with others, but use the privilege you have to make roads for others to be able to speak for themselves. I think we saw this a lot in the school opening and closing, which I know is a really touchy subject. I'm lucky to have a 3-year-old, so we're still in daycare. But folks were advocating a lot for, I saw a lot of white parents, a lot of white upper class parents advocating for Black and brown families, saying this is what they want, this is what they want. Instead, you should say, like, well, what does the outreach process look like for the siting of specific infrastructure, or the way that we're rethinking the design process for Mass Ave, and use whatever privilege you have to make sure that the right people, the people who are going to be impacted by this decision, are in the room and have the ability to speak for it. So I'd say that's the first one. Use your privilege to create space for others to speak for themselves. And then the other piece is to realize that, like, the changes that we need to make are not going to come without sacrifice. If you are in a very comfortable position right now, and we all need to sort of own that and eat that and realize it's not the end of the world, that maybe if we need to move to getting rid of your gas powered stove and investing in a convection one, like, there's going to be these tiny 1% solutions, but also these larger systemic changes that are going to balance things. And it's going to feel a little bit uncomfortable, but it's the morally right thing to do.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, Jennie, I think framing is a big issue. Framing is a real issue here. So if I think about activism around climate change on the Tufts campus, it changed greatly when we stopped calling it climate change and we call it climate justice. Mm-hmm. We have food justice, we have climate justice, we have environmental justice. These are necessary acknowledgements that the mainstream movements, the environmental, the food, alternative food movement, and the climate movement, have not routinely considered equity and justice issues. But, Cate showed brilliantly how, climate justice is intimately related to neighborhoods, to zip codes. Once that's in your mind, how can you ever ignore that? Similarly with food. I mean, food deserts aren't an economic abnormality. Food deserts were designed by urban planning. I mean, not, nobody said, hey, we'll have a food desert there, we'll have a food desert here. No, but the processes of urban planning led to capital flight from poorer neighborhoods, redlining being hugely significant. And that capital flight basically undermined the ability of neighborhoods to provision culturally appropriate, nutritious foods. So environmental justice, food justice, climate justice, these are frames that I think are more inclusive. And the climate justice frame also brought a lot of the unions into the fray as well, from what was largely, a white middle class dalliance. Climate change was that. So I think there's that. I think second, it's making the links to people's daily lives, which is, what Maria has been talking a lot about. Making the links to people's daily lives and showing that these links you can do something about, as Chelsea Greenspace have been doing. And then I think leadership is really important. I'm not going to say who I'm backing for the leadership for the mayor of Boston, but one of the candidates has a food justice agenda which locates white supremacy as one of the problems that need to be tackled in providing nutritious food for all. One of the candidates has a Green New Deal for Boston. These are the kinds of inspired leadership ideas that we need. And finally, we need our organizations to look like the communities they serve. There are too many organizations that I see in the food, the climate, and environmental justice sphere that don't really look like the populations they serve. If you don't look like the population you're serving, are you legitimate? Are you trusted? Are you even effective? And I think of an organization like the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, which in the 1980s, before they even constituted the organization, they did a demographic analysis and they made the organization look like the community. That's why DSNI is still around 40 years on. Foundations, the community, the city, everybody likes DSNI because it is the real deal. It looks like the community. So I think all of those different levels, framing, representation, leadership, these, we can do this. Let's not kid ourselves. We can do this. We just, we've got to be intentional about it.
Yeah. And I just wanted to jump in before go to you, Maria, and mention particularly about the framing, and this is for the Green Ribbon Commission as well, in terms of climate action and climate justice action. I think it opens up the conversations and the approach as well, and much, and is an invitation and a opportunity to integrate the social justice into all climate actions. At Northeastern right now, we have a faculty committee that is advocating for, instead of our climate action plan, call it a climate justice action plan, right? And it's exactly that framing that really changes what you're looking at and expanding. So thank you for that. Maria?
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things that Julian was saying at the very end is that we can do this. It's really not rocket science. It's not, it really is in front of your eyes if you want to see it. And for us, the substation example in Chelsea and the microgrid in East Boston and the microgrid example in Chelsea are two examples of what went wrong and how do you do things right. And so the substation Eversource never held a hearing in the neighborhood, never. They did, the EFSB, the Energy Facility Siting Board, did not provide interpretation when we requested it. I mean, that's a real story. We requested interpretation. Residents went and sat there for 4 hours and didn't understand a thing because they said it would be too disruptive. And so I think it's not rocket science. You start the process with the people most impacted at the center and you bring them on board at the very beginning. Not at the very end to check the box and say we did it, but at the very beginning, which is what we've done with the microgrid. From the very beginning, it wasn't a helicopter in of technical people coming into Chelsea saying these are the buildings that you need to pick for your microgrid, but it was a grassroots effort and a ground up effort of what are the buildings that folks in the community think are critical to keep power on in the case of an environmental or climate disaster. So I think that is critical, is bringing the people most impacted on board and centered from the very beginning.
Great. So what I'm going to do now is kind of summarize some of the questions for each of you, all three, and then give you an opportunity each to, respond to whichever ones make sense, because we have quite a lot of questions here. So Cate, I'm going to start with you. And among the questions that came in the chat during and right after your presentation was connections. Could you offer some connections internationally with developing countries in particular? Also some questions about community engagement and how redlining and the legacy of that has impacted capacity for community engagement and engagement with political leaders. There was a question about rationale for deforestation. Why is it that there are less trees in those communities?
Mm-hmm.
Is it an intentional thing or kind of a, and then another question about Groundwork, your organization, and how does your organization help communities to lobby the city and their elected officials to invest more in their communities. So that's a summary of some of the questions. Not comprehensive.
That's it. Just one or two light points to have over tea. Got it. Cool. I'll try and address as many of these as I can in a way that's reasonable and respectful to the other panelists and relatively quick. But I want to touch on the first one around like trees and why is it that our neighborhoods look different? And you'll see that the answer looks different in different cities, but that it all has the same backbone. One example is in Pawtucket and Central Falls, Rhode Island, where they have an urban forestry program they have for a really long time. And the city is interested in doing the right thing, which is densifying the tree canopy cover. But the way that they give out those trees is to have a first come, first serve. And those resources are not advertised in languages other than English. So if you're an English speaker who's aware of the program and has the time and capacity to get in line, and those trees go real fast, then you're going to have a tree in front of your home during that planting season. But if you're a non-English speaker, if maybe you have to work, or maybe you're taking care of a kid in the morning and can't sit and sort of like refresh and wait or call up to get in line for that, you're going to lose out on that. So that's sort of one example in which a city is trying to do the right thing, but just can't. And actually that tree that I showed you in front of my unit, that's because I called over and over and over again Vanessa in the urban forestry department, because there's not a single, in my formerly yellow lined neighborhood, there's not a single tree that was there when we moved in, 3 years ago. So it took me knowing that urban forestry exists and being able to tap into the city's desire to do the right thing. But you see a lack of investment. You see two things. You lack of investment and then a deep skepticism when those investments are made into the community, because there oftentimes is a catch. If you folks are aware of the Million Trees Project in New York, which was under the Bloomberg administration, they were trying to get 1 million trees planted in New York City. I was living on 135th Street and Broadway at the time, and they planted all those trees, and then the next day, every single one of the trees on the block had the head snapped off, because that's also there's also a misconception in some communities, or maybe a correct understanding, that these infrastructure improvements that make the space shadier and nicer and filter out that pollutants, that might be an indicator that gentrification and rising rents are on the rise. And green gentrification is something that at Groundwork we think a lot about. So in some cases, the cities are trying to do the right thing, but they just are not tapped into the communities, and they're not doing it in a way that focuses and centers equity and pays attention to different people have different channels of getting connected to the city. And then there's also sort of a deep skepticism of sort of what's the catch and what's going on with the neighborhood. In terms of building capacity, that is the foundation of what all of the Groundwork trusts do. Our executive directors and often the folks who live in the neighborhoods, not all, but many, and in some cases most, live in the neighborhoods that we work at, neighborhoods that are often formerly redlined and are environmental justice communities. So our local trusts, for the most part, look really similar to the neighborhoods, and a lot of folks were born and raised in those neighborhoods and want to contribute to it. And so what we do is we focus and center relationships, and we understand that there needs to be a really big tent. Change is not going to happen without the city, but the city isn't the only one that needs to lead and direct that change. Residents need to be in the driver's seat, but so frequently they're not even allowed in the car for decision making. So we sort of serve as this intermediary where we build the capacity of residents to kind of speak the language and use the tools. That example in Denver that I showed you of the tree canopy cover, Any resident of Globeville could have looked you in the eye and said, my neighborhood does not have enough trees. They have gone to the city and they have said, my neighborhood doesn't have enough trees. But it's a different story when you're bringing the overlaid redlining map with the tree canopy cover map, and folks realize they can't look away from that injustice and they can't sort of poo-poo it as a lived experience. Residents know what's going on. They don't need these like magical tools, but they kind of do in order to get the attention and the traction that they need to get with the city. So that's what our groundwork trusts are all about, are putting residents in the driver's seat and giving them the technical tools and the capacity to build relationships. This kind of work doesn't have to be contentious. Sometimes it is. But sometimes you need to find that special way to make those relationships work so that the right things and the morally just things are happening. I'm going to stop there. I know there were 77 other questions, but I feel like that's enough time for me.
Jennie, can I just add a couple of things in support of what Cate's saying? Just two things. So Detroit decided, the city of Detroit decided they were going to do some, tree planting in low-income and minority neighborhoods, for the very good reason of climate mitigation, and the residents were up in arms because the organization chosen didn't have a clue about the neighborhood. It wasn't reflective of the neighborhood, and so just building on both what Cate and Maria were saying, that you're dealing with neighborhoods that have had successive, for the last 100 or more years, successive initiatives pushed on them. And we've got this green colonialist idea that, hey, they need urban agriculture, they need trees in their neighborhoods, and that these are foisted on them without any care. Jump to Providence, Rhode Island. One of my former students was working for the city of Providence, and their public health department was doing some tree planting in low-income neighborhoods. And they got a lot of pushback on the species of tree chosen, because people said those species will drip sap onto our cars. So two different things here, two different stories. A very knowledgeable neighborhood, obviously, knowing that these trees are going to drop sap on the cars, and so we don't want those. And then this green colonialist idea of just, putting trees in neighborhoods because it's the good thing to do. It's very complex working with these neighborhoods. And I think people like Cate and Maria are showing how we do that. There's nothing wrong with greening neighborhoods. It's good, but it has to be centered around the communities concerned themselves.
Right.
You can use that as my question if you want.
Well, Julian, I'm just going to summarize a couple of the other quick questions and give you a few minutes to respond. One was about public transit and the cost of public transit. And you mentioned also free public transit in the example on the street in Sweden that you showed. And I know that's been proposed in Boston. And so that would be a great thing to address. Examples of contact theory, kind of how that manifests in terms of policy, I think. Any examples on inclusive park planning? What does that look like? And a question about, is multifamily landlord renter model actually more equitable than the single family homes that you're talking about, or without rent control? So there's a question just about the different models there. So briefly address those questions.
Well, you have 30 seconds to address these massive questions. Okay, public transit. Well, so I've got a student doing some research at the moment, and I'm going to kind of answer the question, but what it suddenly dawned on us is all the time we are looking at dwindling ridership. We use that as almost the singular metric, ridership. And so from really when Uber and Lyft moved into towns, public transit has been, it was on the decline anyway, but it's been speeded up by Uber and Lyft. And then COVID has speeded it up. And I read a piece that said, we need to shift the framing of this debate about public transit, not about ridership and absolute numbers, but about access, who needs it. And if we could come up with an access-based metric, then we could make the case much more strongly for public transit, which is a social good. And I'm all in favor of, creative ways of raising funding for good, efficient public transit systems. Copenhagen built a metro system in 10, 15 years. It's a fabulous system. And they use all kinds of land value taxation and different forms of taxation to fund new lines and to develop the system. We're not creative in terms of public transit. The metrics that we use and the funding streams that we could use. Contact theory, it's again, you know, I think Maria and I have both used this word, it's not rocket science. If you meet people and you can share some time with them, you are, if you're a reasonable person, you are likely to be able to find something to talk about. Now, eating spaces are very good for that. And there is this idea from Yale, from Elijah Anderson, a professor of sociology, who talks about the cosmopolitan canopy. He said that there are places in cities where we let down our guard. We sit and we talk to people. Often these are food-based places, they're markets. And his good example is the Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia, where people across all difference, age, culture, ethnicity, religion, sit and eat and watch a ball game, and they talk about the food. Cosmopolitan canopies are brilliant examples of contact theory. As urban planners, we should be designing spaces around notions of contact. And I'll then jump into this inclusive park planning. So there's many ways of going about this. Again, going to Copenhagen, there is a linear park called Superkilen Park in Copenhagen. And it's in a very diverse immigrant-heavy neighborhood called Nørrebro. And the designers work with the local community to find out what would make an inclusive space. And people all said, I want artifacts from my culture represented in the park. I'd be proud to do that. And it acts as contact theory as well. People were talking to each other. Oh, what relevance does that have in your culture, etc. And these are cultures from Russia to Ghana, from Mexico to Syria. These are cultures from all around the world. Representation, people seeing themselves in spaces, I think is really, really important. And, you know, the final question about the duplexes and triplexes on former single family zoned land, I absolutely agree with your with the questioner. Rent controls are needed. New York is talking about it. Cambridge is talking about it again. Boston's talking about it again. I'll leave you with this thought. Great geographer David Harvey said, we're building cities for people to invest in, not to live in. It's absolutely true. We will have gentrification as long as that is the idea. One of the world's most livable cities, Vienna, is people mainly live in apartments. You can have immigrants and wealthy families in the same apartment block. Vienna is always up there with Vancouver and Sydney and Adelaide and Melbourne as one of the most livable cities, and yet people don't generally own. So rents are low. We do need some form of rent control. It's absolutely obvious to me that simply replacing single family zoning with triplexes and duplexes is not going to do it. So I think my message is we need a multiplicity. There's no silver bullet on this. We need multiple coordinated, integrated policy strategies to tackle these inequalities in neighborhoods.
Great. Alignment among them, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So Maria Belen, among the questions that people had for you include, could you tell us more about the electric substation activism? Are there public hearings and phone bankings that people can get involved in? Some of the audience didn't know anything about what's going on in Chelsea, and people want to learn more and get involved. And there's a question about why have things failed so badly in Chelsea, in particular during COVID, but in other respects as well. And I think very similarly to what Julian mentioned about Minneapolis being known as a progressive green city, you know, one of the questions was saying, we thought Massachusetts was a progressive place, and people may not realize the discrepancy and disparities and the legacy of inequities right here in Massachusetts among our communities in the Boston area. So what organizations specifically are doing the best work, listening to, advocating for, supporting the communities in Massachusetts that have been underinvested in and not prioritized and not listened to in some of these, in many of these issues, I guess. And there's also a question about fossil fuels and the different things, I guess, specifically about natural gas. Some municipalities putting an end to natural gas, but also obviously that speaks to the jet fuels and on the Chelsea Creek and all of that as well. So a whole bunch of things for you to talk about, but you can pick and choose what you'd like to respond to. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I'll say, in our presentation, we talk about the Center for Effective Government grading Massachusetts an F for exposing people of color and people living below the poverty level to hazardous facilities. We don't have to look back to 2016. We can look at now. Massachusetts is it's a lie that this is a progressive state. We have had 2 years of working for environmental justice legislation, and the governor vetoed it. And he probably will veto it again. So the idea that we have leaders at the state and honestly at the federal level, of course, we support our legislators, but we recently heard that the COVID, the act to bring in resources to the communities from COVID from the federal government, that Chelsea's going to get $3 million, $3.9 million. And that every other community around us is going to get 5 times, 6 times, 10 times as much. And so there's something happening where clearly we are not learning the lesson. And I think it does have to do with structural and systemic racism, that people in Chelsea don't matter. They don't matter. They will not vote for or against the governor. So he doesn't need to make Chelsea happy or East Boston happy. The governor has yet to set foot in Chelsea. 1 year of pandemic, 1 year. And Governor Baker has not stepped foot in Chelsea. So I think there's some real, how do you call it, coming to truth moments of people. I'm not from Massachusetts, I'm from Nicaragua, but this is not a progressive state. We have to uncover that. I mean, the fact that we have a substation, we're talking about electrifying the grid. We're talking about electrical vehicles. We're talking about electrifying public transit. Who is going to bear the burden of that? Where are the substations going to be sited? Clearly not in white and wealthy neighborhoods. Obviously, if we see what just happened a couple months ago, or actually a couple weeks ago with the final approval. So in terms of the substation, that was the final approval. We will appeal it, and it hopefully will go to the Supreme Judicial Court. And so we will be asking for support in those matters. This has been years of fighting, though. Secretary Theoharides had a real opportunity to reopen the question of need. She had the authority, she had the power, and she had the opportunity with COVID and so many of the inequities that were uncovered. And she failed to do so. She sided with industry. She decided to turn a blind eye and not focus on the inequities. But here she is promoting the Transportation Climate Initiative as a way to reduce emissions. But who's going to bear the burden of that? So, that's a substation. I think the piece about how do we transition to a green economy, and we talk about just transition, that has a real meaning. What does it mean to transition in a just way? It means that we are prioritizing the communities that have been excluded and sacrificed in the past. It means centering them, and it means reshifting how we're going to site future infrastructure. So it's not that we don't need substations. We weren't asking the EFSB to say no to the substation. If we're really going to electrify the grid, we are going to need more substations. But where are those going to go? Where are they going to be sited, and how are those going to be sited? The fact that the EFSB provided no interpretation in 2017 is a civil rights violation. And we sued the EPA. So these things, I think that part of it is we look at, it's almost like we look at what we want to see, and we don't see what we don't want to see. So we've done our best to get the word out about this campaign, and we have amazing allies across the Commonwealth, where I think folks all over Massachusetts know about this fight. But again, not everybody knows, and not everybody has the opportunity to support. So, in terms of who's doing the work, I think there are incredible organizations on the ground. We work in Chelsea and East Boston, but there are other organizations like Neighbor to Neighbor, like the Chinese Progressive Association, like Alternatives for Community and Environment, where they're anchored in their communities and they're doing the everyday work of community organizing and building power in their own communities. Between Neighbor to Neighbor and GreenRoots, we co-anchor the environmental justice table for Massachusetts, which is how we're pushing for EJ legislation. And so that brings together a broad set of partners and allies that will focus, again, this legislative session in introducing and passing legislation that will prioritize EJ communities. And so really it's not a shock, but it's been 20 years of trying to get EJ legislation in Massachusetts, over 20 years. And so something has to change, something for folks to open their eyes and see what's happening on the ground. Yeah, it's baffling that COVID-19, with everything that it covered, we always knew that there was food insecurity in Chelsea. We always knew that there was we didn't have the safe infrastructure. Suddenly you see all the lines, block after block after block. It's like, oh my God, people who did not see it now see it. But we've been ringing the alarm on environmental justice for decades. And now that it's uncovered, we're still having a hard time learning the lessons in order to make a just transition and make our society more just and equitable.
Well, thank you so much, Maria Belen. And I think we will end here. We're just about out of time. I just want to acknowledge and thank you all for such important contributions to this conversation. We have many more questions and appreciation in the chat here. And I will just say that this has been inspiring and hopefully motivating for folks to get involved and be engaged and build those power coalitions, right? And support and give voice, as Cate put it, use our privilege to create space for others to speak and speak for themselves. So thank you all so much. And this is where we would be clapping and thanking our panelists. And thank you to the audience for joining us. And this has all been recorded, and the presentations will also be made available. And it looks like we have up here the next slide, the next presentations, this next two segments of this series on April 7th. There is an event on anchor institution strategies to advance climate action. And then April 27th is the next of this series on climate change, health and equity with current research and opportunities for progress. So thank you all. And John, I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to say to end.
No, I just want to join you, Jenny, and thanking you and thanking this just extraordinary panel. I think as there are lots of comments in the chat box that this just is really inspiring to those of us who are working on climate action. And I think emboldens us to really shift towards the whole concept of climate justice, as Julian was saying. And the GRC is an initiative specifically around that to figure out how we can bring all the incredible assets of our network to that work. So you'll be hearing more from that. So thank you all, and thank you to the all the participants, those of you who stayed to the very end. And we look forward to you joining us on the 7th and the 27th. You'll be getting, you should have gotten a notification already to register for the Anchor Institution Strategy piece, and you will soon be getting a registration opportunity for the April 27th. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your week.